Hello, and welcome to video 3 in the series on self-hosted implementation of Omeka for librarians. In the previous video, we built a server using Ubuntu Linux, and we put it on a virtual machine using VirtualBox. In this video, we're going to install Apache, MySQL, PHP, and ImageMagick onto that server so that we can then load our instance of Omeka onto the server. So the first thing we're going to do is go to omeka.org and go to documentation and preparing to install. And under preparing your system, there is a link for install on Ubuntu using terminal. I'm going to click on that. These other methods I'm not as familiar with. I'm more comfortable with using the terminal than I am using any kind of graphical user interface or a GUI. So I'm going to click on that. So now that we have our general instructions, we're going to begin installing our software onto our servers. And the first thing we're going to need to do is actually turn on the server. So I'm going to click on VirtualBox. Here you'll see I have a new instance of the Omeka server that I built, and it's called Omeka Clone. The reason for that is yesterday I wanted to test a few things out. As I had mentioned, the Omeka instructions aren't 100% accurate anymore. I'm finding that, a, a great part of the work that I do as a systems person is troubleshooting why things aren't working. And this is particularly prevalent when I'm building a new system. Oftentimes the instructions I find are a year or two old or older. And those instructions, while at the time may have worked really well, don't always work out so well. And this is because things evolve. For instance, Omeka is saying to install PHP 5 when PHP 7 is actually what people are using now. So things like that. I wanted to create a clone to kind of test things out. And despite the fact that this was intended as a test server, I didn't want to build things and then have to delete and remove them later, just because it's time consuming. It was so much easier just to make a clone. In VirtualBox, it's just a matter of right clicking and then clicking on clone. And it takes a couple of minutes to build an exact replica of that server. When you do this, it is important to remember that it is an exact replica, and sometimes settings need to be different for each individual server, particularly in the case of MAC addresses. And a MAC address, as you may or may not know, is the address of all devices have a MAC address, and each device should have a unique MAC address. It just enables communications over the internet. It just makes them, much easier. So to do that with my Omeka clone, I have it highlighted. I'm going to Settings and Network. And in the Network tab, there is an Advanced drop-down. I want to click that. And here you'll see the MAC address, which is exactly the same as my production server, or as my original server. So to change that, you can come in and press this button here. It generates a new random MAC address, and then that way your clone server and your original server won't be competing online. So you want to be sure to do that if you build a clone. Okay, so now let's power up our Omeka server that has yet to have Omeka on it. And in the previous video, I had determined that my MAC address is 10.3.20.141. So when this is completely turned on, there's no need for me to log in. I would like to use PuTTY as opposed to VirtualBox. The interface with PuTTY just works out much better for me. So I'm going to first minimize and then minimize that and open PuTTY. So now I want to log in to my virtual server. So this server here is up and running, and I'm actually going to log into it using PuTTY. And so my IP address, after finding it using ifconfig in the previous video, is 10.3.20.141. And we'll open it, and it will we'll log in as library admin, and then I'll put in my password. And so we are now logged into our virtual server. I'm just going to minimize this and open this up. Now that we're in the server, we can begin installing the software we need to actually build Omeka. I'm not going to follow the Omeka instructions line by line, but I will start out with getting unzip, and then I'm going to move to Apache, then MySQL, then PHP, and then ImageMagick for the very last thing. And the reason for that is it's just easier to start with the base, and the base in this case is our web server, Apache. So first I'm going to install unzip because we have zip files that we're going to need to unzip. So those instructions are accurate. Sudo apt get install unzip, and it'll take a second or two to get that. Okay, so that is done. Now we want to install Apache 2, and we'll do that with sudo apt get install Apache 2. And so it's asking me if I want to use that amount of space to install Apache, and I do. So yes, and enter. And these first few are actually quite easy. I didn't run into any problems with these on my tests yesterday. To make this a little easier, maybe I want to minimize the screen a little. Okay. And also to make it a little easier, I'm just going to clear. Okay, so we have installed unzip, we have installed Apache 2. Now we're going to install MySQL Server. So sudo apt get install MySQL server, and enter, and yes. And so here it's asking us to provide a password for the root user. In Linux and in MySQL, the user who has all of the power is the root user. They have no restrictions whatsoever. They can do whatever they want. It's typically advised not to be logged in as root user. Instead, it's better to be an admin that has root privileges. That's where the sudo comes into play. So whenever we're typing sudo apt-get, that means, as an administrator, I'm going to use root access for this instance. So in this case, it's asking, password for root user, and this is going to be important later on when we're building our Omeka database. So don't forget this password. And then repeat it. And I'm just using a generic password. This is a pretty secure server. It's installed on my machine, so the likelihood of somebody getting into it and messing around with things is pretty minimal. So I'm just using a generic password called password, and you'll see that later on. There are configuration files that will require us to enter our password later down the line. So now that MySQL Server is installed, the next thing we're going to want to do is install PHP. So I've cleared my screen before we install PHP. And this yesterday when I was doing this turned out to be a little problematic. So the instructions on the Omeka website are saying use sudo apt-get install PHP 5. Okay, so sudo apt-get install PHP 5. And this is what happens. Package PHP 5 has no installation candidate. There are a number of ways to load things on Linux, and maybe in the next video when I'm working on the production server, maybe I'll show a different way of going about things. But with this test server, I'm using a repository, an Ubuntu repository, and I don't want to get into details on that, but I do think it's worth your while to kind of look into online. Essentially, the repository is what allows us to get, it points to the packages that we're sudo apt installing. So the apt program refers to these repositories. It's called a source list, I think, in the when you're going through the directories. So it'll go to the source list. The source list will kind of point the computer where to go to get the package. So in this case, PHP 5 is not a package in any of the repositories I have loaded onto my Ubuntu 16 server. So this can be a problem. So what I did was I poked around and I found a website that actually gave me a command that's more recent that will actually get what I need. So I found that on this website here, linode.com. You can pause the video and copy the URL here if you like to come and have a look at it. It has some really great advice on loading a LAMP server. And so here they have instructions for PHP 7, and these are actually the instructions I'm going to use. So I'm going to ignore what Omeka has to say, and I'm going to install PHP 7. And as I've mentioned before, this isn't uncommon. You can't update every little thing that comes into play when you're writing for your online instructions. So you're going to find this with any system. The command doesn't always work, and it requires a bunch of Google searches to kind of figure out why it's not working, ways of working around it, that sort of thing. So that's what I did yesterday. And rather than show it in the video, I just did it myself so that I could kind of come back and report on my findings. So we are going to use the instructions on linode.com, and I'm going to do sudo apt install PHP 7.0. And so while we're at it, they're also recommending that we install two other pieces of software. One of those is lib Apache 2 mod -php 7.0, and the other one is PHP 7.0 dash MySQL. So we're going to load these three packages all at once. The last two are just ways of allowing Apache to talk to PHP and allowing MySQL to talk to PHP. They're important, so they need to be added. I can't remember if Omeka had a similar. Yeah, they do. So Omeka was the Omeka instructions. For instance, have the PHP 5 MySQL. So this would have allowed for MySQL to talk to PHP 5. Okay, so our packages are finished, and the last thing we want to do is get ImageMagick installed, and we'll see how this goes. I've had mixed results with this in the past. If we do sudo apt-get install ImageMagick, and let's see what happens. That works, so we're lucky. And this is another important piece to the mix. So be sure you get it installed. If you run into problems, like I said, doing Google searches are really your best hope of solving the problem. So I highly recommend going that route. Now that things are finished loading, we want to test a couple of things. I want to be sure that both Apache and PHP are up and running properly. And we can do that by actually using a web browser and going to the IP address. Before I do that, I do want to set things up so I can test PHP. And we can do that by changing directories. So CD for changing directories, and then we want the file path, the directory path of var/www/html, and enter. And so now we have moved to the HTML directory, and here we want to open up a text editor and create a PHP file. So what I'm going to do is sudo nano, and nano is the text editor. So we're, as an administrator, open the text editor. If there was an existing file, we could just type it in here, but this is a file we're creating. Well, it's actually the same thing. So even though this file does not exist, it will open up the text editor. So this file I'm going to call php test.php, and enter. And so now we have to do a simple PHP file, and you don't need to really understand or know PHP. You can just follow along. It's a pretty simple command. So we need to open up PHP. So we do the bracket and question mark and PHP, and then I'm just gonna enter down a little bit here and do question mark and bracket. And so everything contained between this line and this line is my PHP code. And here all I'm going to do is call a PHP function, called PHP info. So PHP info and a semicolon. And then if you press Control X, and we do want to save our file, so we do yes, and then the file name to write to phptest.php, and enter. And so now if we list the items in the HTML directory, li-l, ls-l, you'll see that we now have php test.php. Now what we can do is go to our web browser, and I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to go to my IP address, which is 10.3.20.141. And if you put in your IP address, you should see this exact same thing. This is the Apache 2 Ubuntu default page. This means that everything loaded properly for Apache. Now we can test our PHP by going to our IP address, and if we put slash php test.php for our file. So what this is going to do is open up our PHP file and run that PHP function called PHP info. So we hit enter, and this is the page you want to see. It's going to give you all sorts of good server information, and it indicates to us that PHP is indeed up and running. So we can continue with the process. Okay, so we have accomplished our goal of finishing our LAMP server. We put Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and ImageMagick on our Linux server. So we've accomplished what we set out to do. I think I'm going to stop this video here, and then in the next video we'll go on to step 2, where we download and install Omeka. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.